28 years on this bench, son. And you are the kind of young man I have spent 28 years trying to keep off the streets of this county. Judge Harlan Crawford's voice carried across courtroom 4 billion of the Macomb County Circuit Courthouse with the weight of a man who believed every word he said. Deshaun Mosley, 17 years old, 6 feet tall, 148 pounds, stood at the defense table in a county-issued orange jumpsuit 2 sizes too big and the same pair of dollar store reading glasses his grandmother had bought him for school the previous September. His mother Latrice was in the gallery's second row, holding the hand of her own mother Bernice, who had not stopped weeping for 40 minutes. Deshaun's public defender, a 31-year-old man named Owen Riley who carried 232 active cases and who had been assigned to Deshaun's file 19 minutes before the original arraignment, stood beside him in a suit that needed pressing. The prosecution had asked for the maximum sentence. The maximum sentence under Michigan law for armed robbery and aggravated assault committed by a juvenile waived to adult court was 25 to 40 years. Judge Crawford was, by every visible indication, about to grant it. He had already begun the formal recitation. He had reached a sentence beginning, "I therefore impose, under the authority vested in me by the state of Michigan," when the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open with the unmistakable percussive sound of a federal warrant being served. 3 people walked in. 2 of them wore dark suits. The lead figure, a black woman, mid-40s, navy blazer, hair pulled back in a low bun. FBI credentials clipped visibly to her belt, and the strap of her shoulder bag did not stop walking until she had crossed approximately 2/3 of the center aisle, at which point she stopped and held up one hand, palm flat, in the universal gesture that said, "Do not finish that sentence." Judge Harlan Crawford stopped mid-word. The court reporter's fingers froze above her stenotype. Owen Riley, who had not slept in 40 hours and who had been preparing for the worst day of his short career, looked at the woman in the navy blazer as though she might be a hallucination. Behind her, the 2 agents in dark suits had not closed the courtroom doors. The lead agent did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The courtroom had gone so silent that her words, when they came, carried to every corner of the room with the unhurried clarity of a federal investigator who knew she had the entire institutional weight of the United States government behind every syllable. "Your Honor, with respect to the court, my name is Special Agent Renee Holloway, FBI Detroit Field Office. I am here to inform this court, on the record, that the defendant standing before you did not commit the crime for which he is about to be sentenced. The actual perpetrator walked into my office and confessed at 8:14 this morning. We have a signed statement. We have corroborating physical evidence. We have video. I am respectfully but formally requesting that you suspend this proceeding immediately." Judge Harlan Crawford did not move. His gavel hovered approximately 2 inches above the bench, where it had been suspended at the moment Agent Holloway had walked through the doors. The color in his face did not drain. It moved sideways, in patches, as though the blood had been redistributed rather than withdrawn. In the gallery, Deshaun Mosley's grandmother Bernice stopped weeping in mid-sob. The courtroom held its breath, and Deshaun Mosley, who had not been permitted to speak for himself at any meaningful point in the previous 14 months, and who had been preparing himself in the way a 17-year-old prepares himself for the irreparable, to spend the next quarter-century in a state prison for a crime he had not committed, slowly turned his head to look at the black woman in the navy blazer who had just, in 84 words, returned to him a future that he had stopped believing was possible. 14 months earlier, on the night of January 17, the 7-Eleven on 12 Mile Road in Roseville, Michigan, had been robbed at gunpoint at 11:47 p.m. The clerk on duty, a Yemeni-American man in his 50s named Faisal al-Muteri, had been pistol-whipped during the robbery and had suffered a skull fracture, a concussion, and significant blood loss. The robber had taken approximately $342 from the register and a small box of prepaid Visa cards. He had fled on foot through the back parking lot of the store, west across an empty lot and into the residential neighborhood beyond. He had been wearing a gray hoodie pulled tight around his face, dark jeans, and dark sneakers. Mr. Al-Materi, recovering at Belmont Hospital the following morning with a concussion that would prove to have permanent cognitive effects, had been able to provide only the most generic description: male, dark hood, dark clothes, average height, possibly black or possibly Hispanic. The Roseville Police Department had assigned the case to a detective named Sergeant Brian Doheny. who had been on the force for 19 years and whose closure rate on assault and robbery cases involving black suspects was by every internal department metric slightly higher than the regional average. Deshaun Mosley had been arrested on the morning of January 19, less than 36 hours after the robbery, on the basis of an identification by Mr. Al-Materi from a 6-photo lineup. The lineup had been administered by Sergeant Doheny himself, which violated the Roseville Police Department's own written policy requiring administration of photo arrays by an officer not involved in the underlying investigation. The lineup had included Deshaun, who at the time had been a 16-year-old high school sophomore with a clean record, an A-minus GPA, and a part-time job at a movie theater, and 5 filler photos that did not by any reasonable standard resemble Deshaun closely enough to constitute a fair array. Mr. Al-Materi, still hospitalized and still on heavy painkillers, had identified Deshaun as the closest one. Sergeant Doheny had recorded the identification as positive. Deshaun had been arrested at his grandmother Bernice's house in East Point at 7:14 a.m. the following morning, in his pajamas, in front of his mother and grandmother. He had been held overnight without bail. He had been arraigned the following Tuesday in front of Judge Harlan Crawford, who had ordered him bound over for trial as an adult on the basis of the seriousness of the underlying charge and what the judge had described on the record as the troubling pattern of violence by young men in our community. Deshaun Mosley had had no history of violence. Deshaun Mosley had had no history of any kind. His mother, Latrice, worked as a certified nursing assistant at a long-term care facility in St. Clair Shores. His grandmother, Bernice, was a retired Detroit Public Schools cafeteria manager. His father, a long-haul truck driver named Antoine Mosley, had been killed in an accident on I-94 outside Battle Creek when Deshaun was 9 years old. Deshaun played trumpet in his high school marching band. He had been accepted 3 weeks before the robbery into a summer pre-college engineering program at Michigan State University on a partial scholarship. None of that had appeared in Judge Harlan Crawford's bind-over order. The order had described Deshaun as a young man whose disposition appears by the evidence presented to this court to align with the troubling profile of violent juvenile offenders this jurisdiction has been struggling to address. The trial had lasted 3 days. Owen Riley, the public defender, had done what a public defender with 232 active cases could do, which was very little. He had cross-examined Mr. Al-Materi gently on the unreliability of cross-racial identification by a witness under heavy painkillers. He had questioned the procedural integrity of the photo lineup. He had pointed out the absence of DNA, fingerprints, or any other physical evidence linking Deshaun to the crime. He had not, however, been granted funds by the court to retain an independent eyewitness identification expert. Riley had requested the funds 3 times. Judge Crawford had denied them 3 times, citing the limits of the indigent defense budget for the present fiscal year. The jury, which had been seated through a voir dire process that had eliminated the only 2 black potential jurors via peremptory challenges by the prosecution, had deliberated for 90 minutes. The verdict had been unanimous. Owen Riley had told Deshaun, in the holding cell behind the courtroom, an hour after the verdict, that he was so sorry that he had done everything he could, and that he believed Deshaun was innocent. Deshaun had nodded. He had not cried. He had said quietly, "Mr. Riley, what's my mom going to do?" The sentencing hearing had been scheduled for 31 days later at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in the second week of March. Tyler Brennan was 19 years old, white, 5'10", 160 pounds, with a sparse blonde beard he had been growing since he was 16, a methamphetamine habit he had developed in his senior year of high school, and a criminal history that included 3 misdemeanor possession charges. He lived in a trailer outside Mount Clemens with his mother, a postal worker named Donna Brennan. Tyler had been the actual perpetrator of the January 17 robbery of the 7-Eleven on 12 Mile Road. He had also been the perpetrator of 7 other armed robberies in the previous 18 months, 4 in Michigan and 2 in Ohio, which was why when the FBI's Detroit field office had quietly opened a multi-jurisdictional investigation the previous October, the case had crossed federal interstate commerce thresholds, and the field office had taken jurisdiction. One of the other robberies, a gas station outside Toledo in November, had ended with a customer being shot in the leg. Tyler Brennan had been the FBI's primary suspect in that case since approximately the 3rd week of December, based on grainy interior surveillance footage. The Bureau had been 3 weeks away from a coordinated takedown operation. Tyler Brennan had taken 3 days off the meth at the end of February, on the urging of his mother. He had spent 4 nights barely sleeping. He had thought, in those 4 sleepless nights, about Faisal al-Mutari at the 7-Eleven, whose blood had pooled around his head on the linoleum floor as Tyler had walked out the front door with the cash. He had thought about the customer in Toledo whose leg he had shot. He had thought about his mother. He had called his mother into the kitchen at 5:42 a.m. on the morning of March 12. He had told her, in a voice that did not sound like his own, that he needed her to drive him to the FBI office in Detroit. Donna Brennan had not asked what for. She had picked up her car keys. They had driven the 43 miles to the federal building on Michigan Avenue. They had walked into the FBI Detroit field office at 8:07 a.m. Tyler Brennan had told the receptionist at the front desk that he wanted to confess to a string of armed robberies. The receptionist had pressed a button under her desk. Within 4 minutes, Tyler Brennan had been in a small interview room on the third floor drinking a paper cup of water in front of 2 agents, one of whom was Special Agent Renee Holloway. Renee Holloway was 46 years old, born in Detroit, raised in Inkster, the daughter of a Wayne County Sheriff's deputy and a public school principal. She had earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan and a master's in criminal justice at John Jay College. She had joined the FBI in 2003. She had worked counterintelligence in Washington for 6 years and organized crime in Chicago for 5, before returning home to the Detroit field office 4 years earlier to be closer to her mother. She had 2 daughters, ages 13 and 10. She had been the lead agent on the multi-jurisdictional armed robbery investigation involving Tyler Brennan since the previous October. She had not anticipated, when she sat down across the table from Tyler Brennan at 8:14 a.m., that the next 90 minutes would require her to do anything she had not previously done in 21 years of federal law enforcement. Tyler Brennan had spoken for approximately 14 minutes before he mentioned the 7-Eleven on 12 Mile Road. He had described the robbery in detail. The time of night, the way the bell on the door had rung when he pushed it open, the way the clerk had reached for the silent alarm under the counter before Tyler had brought the butt of the handgun down on the side of the clerk's head. He had described the prepaid Visa cards. He had described the gray hoodie which was still in a duffel bag under his bed in his mother's trailer. He had described the handgun, a stolen Glock 19 that he had purchased for $200 from a man in a parking lot in Hamtramck and that was now wrapped in a plastic grocery bag inside the same duffel bag. He had described the route he had taken on foot from the back of the 7-Eleven through the empty lot to the residential neighborhood. Agent Holloway had been writing in her notebook with the precise economy she had developed over 21 years. She had registered at approximately the 8-minute mark that the date Tyler had given for the 7-Eleven robbery was January 17. She had stopped writing for exactly 2 seconds. She had looked up at Tyler Brennan. She had said, in her calm professional voice, "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to step out of the room for 60 seconds. My colleague, Agent Diaz, is going to remain with you. Please continue your statement when I return." Agent Holloway had walked into the hallway. She had pulled out her phone. She had opened a search application that the FBI's Detroit field office maintained on the regional case database. She had typed in Roseville 7-Eleven, January 17. The case file had loaded in approximately 2 seconds. The name of the defendant had been displayed at the top of the file. The name was Mosley Deshaun Antoine. The defendant's status was convicted, sentencing scheduled. The sentencing time was 9 a.m. The sentencing courtroom was 4 billion at the Macomb County Circuit Courthouse. The judge was Crawford Harlan E. The current time on Agent Holloway's phone was 8:23 a.m. Renee Holloway had stood in the hallway of the 3rd floor of the FBI Detroit field office for approximately 12 seconds. She had thought, in those 12 seconds, about a number of things at once. She had thought about Tyler Brennan, who was at that moment sitting in an interview room 3 doors down, willing to sign a written confession to a robbery a black teenager was about to be sent to prison for. She had thought about Deshaun Mosley, whom she had never met, who was at that moment standing in a courtroom 37 minutes drive from where she was standing, waiting for a sentence that would consume the next 25 to 40 years of his life. She had thought about the half-mile of red tape that would normally stand between an FBI agent and an active state court sentencing hearing. She had walked back into the interview room. She had said, in the same calm professional voice, "Mr. Brennan, I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to write down in your own handwriting the date and the time and the location of the 7-Eleven robbery you just described, and your signature, and the date and the time of this statement. I have a paper and a pen here. Please do it now, then I need you to wait here with Agent Diaz while I make a phone call. Can you do that? He had written. Agent Holloway had watched him write. The note had taken 3 minutes. Agent Holloway had photographed it with her phone. She had texted the photograph to her supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Michael Tran, with a single accompanying message. Urgent. Confession to crime currently being sentenced in Macomb County 9 a.m. today. Need authorization to suspend proceeding. Will explain. SAC Tran had texted back 19 seconds later. Authorized. Take 2 agents. Go now. Call me from the car. Agent Holloway had grabbed Agent Diaz and 1 additional agent named Lopez. They had left the FBI Detroit field office at 8:31 a.m. They had taken Agent Diaz's vehicle. They had driven the 37 miles to the Macomb County Circuit Courthouse with their lights and siren active for the final 18 miles. After Agent Holloway had called the SAC from the passenger seat and received explicit authorization to do so, they had pulled into the courthouse loading bay at 8:54 a.m. They had cleared courthouse security in 3 minutes due to a phone call from SAC Tran's office to the chief courthouse security officer that had been placed during their drive. They had reached the 4th floor at 8:58 a.m. They had walked toward courtroom 4 billion with measured speed. They had reached the heavy oak doors at 8:59 a.m. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Harlan Crawford had been 7 minutes into his sentencing remarks. He had spoken about the seriousness of the offense. He had spoken about the importance of holding young men accountable. He had spoken about the need for the community to see that violence had consequences. He had begun his formal recitation of the sentence at 9:06 a.m. He had reached the phrase, "I therefore impose under the authority vested in me by the state of Michigan," at 9 hours 6 minutes and 47 seconds a.m. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom had slammed open at 9 hours 6 minutes and 48 seconds a.m. Agent Renee Holloway had walked 20 paces up the center aisle. She had stopped. She had held up her hand. She had spoken. Judge Harlan Crawford did not at first lower his gavel. He stared at Agent Holloway for what felt to every witness in the courtroom like a very long time, but was in fact approximately 5 seconds. He looked at the badge clipped to her belt. He looked at the 2 agents flanking her. He looked at the bailiff at the back of the room who had not moved and who had not by every visible indication intended to challenge a federal agent in his courtroom. He looked at the prosecution table, where Assistant Prosecutor Andrew Faulkner had gone entirely still with his pen suspended above a legal pad. He looked at the defense table, where Owen Riley was staring at Agent Holloway with the slow, careful expression of a man who did not yet permit himself to hope. He looked at Deshaun Mosley. He looked back at Agent Holloway. Agent Holloway, I will need to verify, Your Honor. With respect, I have the signed confession in my bag. I have a photograph of the confession in the suspect's own handwriting dated and timed 19 minutes ago. I have the supplementary case file from the FBI's multi-jurisdictional armed robbery investigation that has been ongoing since October. The special agent in charge of the Detroit field office is available to confirm everything I have just stated by phone within 90 seconds. I would respectfully request that the court issue an immediate stay of the proceeding pending verification. Judge Crawford did not speak for another 4 seconds. Then, slowly, he lowered his gavel. He did not bang it. He set it down. His hand was trembling. He cleared his throat. The court will be in recess for 30 minutes. The defendant will remain in the custody of court officers. Counsel will please come to chambers. Agent Holloway turned. She walked 4 steps toward the defense table. She stopped beside Owen Riley. She looked at Deshaun Mosley, who had not yet moved and who was by every visible indication breathing very shallowly. She extended her hand. She said in a voice that was not the voice of a federal investigator, but the voice of a black mother of 2 daughters in suburban Detroit. Mr. Mosley, my name is Renee. I am very, very sorry this took as long as it took. We're going to make this right. Deshaun Mosley did not at first take her hand. He looked at her. He looked at his mother in the gallery. His mother had stood up and was now standing with both of her hands pressed against her mouth, the way a person stands when she has been holding her breath for 14 months and has been told, in the past 90 seconds, that she may finally be permitted to exhale. He looked back at Agent Holloway. He took her hand. He shook it once. He said in a voice that did not sound like the voice of a 17-year-old, "Thank you, ma'am." What happened in the next 4 hours inside the chambers of Judge Harlan Crawford was later reconstructed by reporters working the Detroit Free Press's Justice Beat. The confession was verified. The corroborating evidence, the duffel bag containing the gray hoodie and the Glock 19, which had been recovered by a second team of FBI agents from Donna Brennan's trailer at 9:47 a.m. that same morning, with her written consent, was photographed and entered into a chain of custody log. Sergeant Brian Doheny was called to the courthouse and interviewed under oath. Mr. Faisal Al-Materi was contacted at home by an FBI victim services coordinator. By 1:30 p.m. that same afternoon, Judge Harlan Crawford had vacated Deshaun Mosley's conviction, ordered his immediate release from custody, and entered an order on the record acknowledging errors in the procedural integrity of the underlying investigation that this court did not, at the time of the original proceedings, adequately interrogate. Deshaun Mosley walked out of the Macomb County Circuit Courthouse at 4:14 p.m. that afternoon, in the same clothes he had been wearing when he was arrested 14 months earlier, which had been returned to him in a sealed plastic bag. His mother, Latrice, was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. His grandmother, Bernice, was waiting beside her. He walked down the steps slowly, in the late afternoon Michigan light. His mother hugged him for a long time. His grandmother did not, at first, hug him. She held both of his hands. She looked at his face. She said in the same voice she had used when she had told him to do his homework in the 8th grade, "Deshaun, look at me. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. Do you understand me?" Deshaun nodded. Bernice hugged him then. She did not let go for a very long time. Within 48 hours, the Detroit Free Press had published a 7,400-word investigation into the conduct of Sergeant Brian Doheny's original investigation, the photo lineup procedures of the Roseville Police Department, Judge Harlan Crawford's bind-over decisions in similar cases over the previous decade, and the chronic underfunding of the Macomb County Public Defender's Office. The article was picked up by the New York Times, by NPR, and by 3 legal industry trade publications. Within 10 days, the Michigan Attorney General's office had announced an investigation into the Roseville Police Department's lineup procedures. Within 3 weeks, Sergeant Brian Doheny had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal affairs review that would eventually conclude with his retirement under circumstances his union attorney described as voluntary. Within 2 months, the Michigan Judicial Tenure Commission had opened a formal review of Judge Harlan Crawford's conduct. Judge Crawford retired from the bench 11 months later, 6 weeks before the commission's final report was scheduled to be released. The report, released anyway after his retirement, described his conduct in the Mosley case as reflecting patterns of bias that this commission has documented across multiple proceedings over the past decade. Deshaun Mosley returned to high school in the fall of his senior year, having missed the entirety of the previous spring term and his junior fall semester. The Michigan State University pre-college engineering program he had been accepted to 15 months earlier offered him a deferred admission and a full scholarship for the upcoming summer. He accepted. He graduated from high school the following June with a 3.82 GPA and matriculated at Michigan State's engineering program that fall on the same scholarship. He gave one interview during his freshman year to the State News, in which he said he did not, at that time, wish to discuss his case in detail. He said only, when asked what he wanted people to take away from his experience, "I want them to remember that the agent who walked into that courtroom that morning, she didn't have to. She could have sent a junior agent. She could have made the phone call from her office and let the system figure it out. She came in person. She made it her own face in that courtroom. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be that kind of person for somebody else." Tyler Brennan pled guilty to 8 counts of armed robbery, 1 count of aggravated assault, and 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon. He cooperated extensively with the FBI's ongoing investigation. He was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. He requested through his court-appointed federal public defender that a letter of apology he had written by hand be entered into the court record at his sentencing hearing. The letter was addressed to Faisal Al-Materi, to the customer he had shot in Toledo, and to Deshaun Mosley. The judge had read the letter aloud at sentencing. Tyler Brennan had wept through the reading. Deshaun Mosley's mother, Latrice, would later confirm to a journalist that he had read it twice and that he kept it in a folder in his desk drawer at his college dormitory. Special Agent Renee Holloway returned to the FBI Detroit field office and continued to work the multi-jurisdictional armed robbery investigation that Tyler Brennan's confession had effectively closed. She received a formal commendation from the director of the FBI 6 months later. She did not, in the months following the case, give any public interviews. She continued to drive her silver Toyota Highlander. She continued to take her daughters to school in the mornings. On a Saturday afternoon in September, 18 months after the morning at the Macomb County Circuit Courthouse, she received a small envelope in her work mail. The envelope had a Michigan State University return address. Inside was a handwritten note. It said in careful but slightly rushed handwriting, "Agent Holloway, I started college last week. I am studying engineering. My mom sends her love. My grandma sends her prayers. I send my thanks. I am still here because you came in person that morning. I will not forget. Deshaun Mosley." Renee Holloway read the note twice. She folded it. She placed it in the top drawer of her desk where she kept the small framed photograph of her two daughters. She closed the drawer. She returned to the case file open on her computer screen. Outside her office window, the September light came down through the windows of the Detroit field office at its usual angle, falling across her keyboard in a long, warm rectangle. Agent Holloway went back to work.